Content warning. This video contains Halloween-themed decor, including skulls and skeletons, as well as a hanging undead pirate with no gore. If you are sensitive to the subject matter, this may not be the video for you. I may do a non-Halloween themed instructional video in the future. If you are interested in continuing to watch this video, please continue watching for the remainder of this tutorial.
Hello denizens of the internet, this is Kira Una coming to you today. We've had a bit of a request to learn how to make clothing that are based solely on our own measurements. We're not using a commercial pattern. We're going to be essentially using instructions from the internet in general. I've done a couple of different searches, as well as YouTubers that have made these over the past, say, couple of years, or even those who subscribe to different groups like the SCA, for example. We are going to be making essentially a dress that is based on a shift pattern. A shift is an undergarment that was worn very frequently for many, I believe it's been like a couple of centuries, or it's essentially a smock or a dress that goes underneath clothing to keep your body dry and clean. These were washed very frequently, but in modern times we have modern materials. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be using cotton poplin, and we're going to be making this shift into essentially a dress pattern. Now, if you're somebody who prefers just a shirt instead of a dress, you can stop it at the waist or a little bit below your waist just so that you can tuck it into pants, and you can use the exact same pattern using your own measurements. So it doesn't matter how you are bodily shaped, you can follow along with this tutorial. And because we are within the Halloween theme season, the fabric we're using is skull printed. So for anybody who does not like creepy, spooky things, or who does not like the Halloween aesthetic, please be aware that this is in part a tutorial, but it also has skull and crossbones on the fabric itself. This is your preemptive content warning for more spooky stuff. And I just realized there's a skeleton in the background, and I do apologize about that. I will have to put a placard up before I do this. Who let me have a YouTube channel in the first place? I'm just rambling at this point. Let's ignore the ramble, let's get on with the math, and let's get sewing. And I realized I was also looking off camera. Why do I do this? The camera lens is there, not there. I need googly eyes or something over here on my camera just so I know where the camera lens is, so I'm not talking over there. Over there.
One of the first things you're going to want to do is to grab a pen and paper or recording instrument of choice, as well as a measuring tape. You can use a long piece of paper and just mark down the lengths as you go, which is what was done historically. The first measurement we'll be taking is from the top of the shoulder to the bottom hemline of your dress or shirt. I'm going to be making mine go all the way down to my lower leg, but you can make yours as short as just below the waist if you would like. I'm just using the measuring tape width to start the mark at the lower hem point, and using the total measurement length at my shoulder for easier recording. You may also want to measure from the top of your shoulder to the top of your hips so you know where you want to insert your gores, depending on how hippie or busty you are. If you are narrow in the chest, you may be able to start with the gores a little lower. If you're bigger in the bust, you may need to start with the gores at the base of the underarm gusset. We'll get to that in a bit. You will want to take the next measurement across the shoulders from the shoulder bone to the opposite shoulder bone across the back of your neck. This will be the base width for your shirt or dress. If you are wearing a modern shirt, you may wish to measure from the nape of your neck in line with the top of your shoulder down to the collar line to get an idea of how much you want your shirt to dip in the back. Next, take a measurement of how far in the front you would like the front of your shirt to dip. Typically, the divot in the clavicle is about where your top of your shoulder is to get this measurement. Now, you can make this dip as low for you as you would like to accommodate for your modesty or comfort preferences, or for the style of the type of the shift that you're making. If you're making it for an undergarment with a lower high neckline, if it's meant to be worn with stays, a kirtle, or an apron dress, or an additional tunic or a vest. You will need the length of your arm from the shoulder to as long as or as short as the wrist or your hands as you would like it. The measure from the shoulder bone again to your wrist or your hand. Please make sure that you leave a little bit of extra to fold over for the hem by about an inch. And now for the width of your sleeve, which will make up the arm's eye. You will want to measure from the top of your shoulder to how low you want your sleeve to be under your arm. This length will be doubled to make sure that you have the circumference of your arm for the sleeve. You may want to, for good measure, to take a moment to measure around your bust to help you with your math. This will help to ensure that you have enough ease to get your garment on or off, as there are no buttons or closures on this specific draft of the garment. You will also want to measure from your neck to the end of your shoulder to determine how wide your shoulders will be. This gray base skull cotton poplin will be our fabric of choice today for this draft and for this tutorial. Before cutting any of your pattern pieces or before cutting into your base fabric, for all of your base measurements, it's important that you add at least 1 inch to allow for your seam allowance, as we will be including ½ inch of seam allowance on each seam. If you need more, add a little bit more width to each of your pieces to accommodate for a little bit of additional wiggle room. Some people may want to go up 1 inch, some people may add 2. This is entirely up to you, depending on how much ease you would like in your garment. Start with your fabric and cut 2 full width lengths, that is from the top of your shoulder to the bottom hem, one for the front and one for the back. Now is a good time to take a moment and iron and press all of your fabric flat to make sure that everything is going to sit nice and tidy as you're trying to sew it or cut it. I am not particularly fond of the action of ironing or pressing seams down, especially if it's hot out. However, this also creates a very clean seam. It helps to prevent any bunches or wrinkles in funny places, so I highly recommend that you don't skip this step. The next step is to cut 2 full widths of the fabric that is long enough for your arms. Ensure that your fabric is lined up along the selvage edges or the machine manufactured edges when you are measuring, as the selvage edge will become part of the inside seams, so it'll be hidden. Now, you can cut off the selvages and mark from the cut edge so long as your cutting line is straight and it runs parallel with the selvage or manufactured edge of the fabric. And then mark and cut the width of your arm and make sure that you save the rest for later, as this will be the additional fabric that you need for the hip gores for your shift or dress. If you want to, depending on how wide the sleeves are, you can take the width of the fabric, fold it in half to match the selvages, as most people won't have a sleeve that takes up the whole width of the fabric for one arm. Press it on the fold and then cut the line that was made by the folded edge. This helps you to measure out the width of your sleeve, as I'm doing here. Set aside any leftover fabric for later. I'm marking my lines out in chalk, and you can use a washout marker, or so long as you're keeping all of your marks to the inside seams, you can use a Frixion marker, which will fade with heat, or you can use pencil. I know my chalk lines aren't that easy to see on the fabric, but you'll see where I'm cutting. Here you can see where I'm cutting along that folded line. To keep things easier for yourself, you can mark on the inside on one edge for what that piece is, so you don't get them mixed up from the main body pieces. say one left arm, one right arm. And we'll set the arm pieces aside for later. This next section is the back main body piece that was cut for the length, but now we folded this piece in half. I'm going to mark out the width that I need, and essentially by taking my shoulder to shoulder width and then use half that measurement, since the fold of the fabric will be the center back of the main body piece. We will again be setting the extra pieces aside for later for the full length gores that will be inserted under the underarm. Now, since watching me mark and cut this fabric out is like watching paint dry, I'll cut to where we need to start marking out the neckline. Okay, so I might have lied a little bit. I decided that I was going to mark out the neckline first. With the piece folded in half, the folded line will be the middle back of the shirt in the back. I took my measurement from the shoulder to the neckline, and with that measurement, I measured from the mark that I made for the cut line for the width of the shirt, going inward to the inner edge of the neckline, and then I made the mark there, so I know where to cut for the neckline. And then what I had done is I had made a 2-inch long line from the top edge of what will be the shoulder seam, and I marked it about 2 inches down, and I made sure that this drop in the neckline was even all the way across the fold line with little marks. Having a clear ruler in order to see where you're marking is very beneficial, and I highly recommend obtaining one or investing in one if you can. You can typically find these at quilt stores and sometimes at your local fabric store, depending on what they have in stock for clear rulers. Essentially, that sort of rectangle that I made is going to be how deep the back of the neckline dips. So this was one of the measurements that we had taken a little earlier. Now what I'm doing is I'm using a French curve here to round out the neckline, but you can use any easily obtainable round object to make the curve for your neckline to the shoulder seam. Now, if you have a really good eye, you can make this curve by hand. So now we're just going to cut out that neckline, and then we're going to cut out the side fabric and hold aside the extra scraps for later for the side gores that we'll need a little later. As I open up the back of the piece, you can see the shape of the neck is starting to take shape. So you can kind of get an idea of how it's going to look and how it's going to sit once everything is sewn together. I'm marking on the very center back line just inside the seam line with the letters CB so that I know that is for center back. With the fabric piece open, I'm going to take the opportunity to mark the shoulder sewing line and the side sewing lines a 1/2 inch in, which will be my seam allowance. As my near antique sewing machine doesn't have the marks on the base plate as a guide, I'll need to make markings to help guide me. Most modern sewing machines have marks on the base plate to guide you as you sew for all of your seam allowances, and again, I'm using a clear ruler to help me with this. If you don't have access to one of the clear rulers, you can use one of the small sewing rulers to mark out your 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then just grab a longer straight edge to line them all up and give yourself a good solid line to follow. Next, we're going to take the front piece and do exactly the same thing that we did for the back piece, except we're going to cut a little bit deeper in the front of the neck. and this is for the neckline to make that dip about 3 to 4 inches deep. You can make it deeper if you so choose to do so, again depending on your comfort or modesty levels or for the era that you're aiming for. The extra pieces of fabric that we set aside earlier that was cut from both the front and back main pieces will not go to waste. What we're going to do is to make the triangles for the gores. To do this, we will need to ensure that both layers are kept together, and we'll take up the opposite corners and fold them into even triangles. You can also do this with a long ruler and draw from one corner to the opposite corner to get the same effect, and then cut the triangles for the gores and set them aside for the moment. First things first, we're going to sew the shoulder seams. The sewing seam will be on the sewing lines that we marked out earlier. Typically you'll want to use a matching thread, but as most of my thread is black or white, we're going to be using black. I'll be using my matching thread that matches the gray for any felling stitches and hemming stitches a little bit later on. Because this old 99 casing or sewing machine doesn't go backwards, the best way to start your seam is to sew a bit forwards, turn it around, go back over the same seam line, then turn it back around again and go forwards. And then again, going backwards, forwards, backwards at the end of the seam to seal it in. Using the needle inside the fabric as a pivot point. Keeping the needle itself inside the fabric as a pivot point will come in handy for many other sewing projects and is a bit of a technique that the pros even use when sewing sharp corners. Next, we're going to mark our sewing line on the width of the sleeves. This will be the shoulder seam that attaches to the main pieces. We'll want to make sure that we center the sleeve to match the seam on the middle of the shoulder that connects to the front and back. You may notice I haven't used any pins until now. If you're a beginner, or even if you're an expert and always pin things in place, using a pin to align the middle point is a good way to tack it into place. Now, when sewing these seams together, make sure that you're sewing them right sides of the fabric together. So the right sides of the fabric are facing each other. There is a right side and a wrong side to most fabrics, especially printed ones. The printed side is the right side, and the non-printed side is the wrong side. What I'll be doing with the previous seam is rolling this on each end of the sleeve. You'll want to leave some space that is 6 inches long on each side for the underarm gussets. The underarm gussets that we'll be making on this version for myself is 6 inches square, which at the end will give us a 4-inch finished seam square.
So we have our 6-inch gussets. This is from some of the leftover fabric. 6 inches by 6 inches. Seam rip a little bit. This is a good example of how it's okay to make mistakes. So I had to tear open a couple of extra inches. I'm going to take my gusset, like so, right side together, like so, and we're going to pin it, just so that it doesn't go anywhere. Need to open that up a little bit more, because we have we're going to mark off our 1/2 inch seam allowance in a minute. Because I kept thinking, oh yeah, it's only X amount of inches for the gusset. Meanwhile, I goofed and forgot how big I was planning on making the gusset. I made it 6 inches wide because I still had 1/2 inch seam allowance, because I was thinking, oh yeah, I only had to do like 5, and then taking it in on the other sides, which will only make it 4. But I forgot to take into account the seam allowance, and I don't know how to math today, so yeah. So this is a friendly reminder. This is why math is important. Okay, so we're gonna pin it about here. Let's see if that's close enough to the 1/2 inch seam allowance. Oh, that's pretty darn close. Let's mark that off for a sec. There. And we'll do that. Ooh. Mark the desk. Sure, why not? This is where the video kind of falls apart and turns into hot garbage, because this is why I shouldn't have a YouTube video channel. So, our seam line is marked. So we've got our pin on the corner. Boop. And we're also going to pin it so that this corner, because we're going to sew that to that corner, and then we're going to pivot this and sew it down the other seat. So essentially this is going to make a triangle underneath the armpit. And we're going to, of course, pin here. And we also have to sew out the rest of the seam allowances, because then I'll show you how to go about doing the sleeves. The rest of the sleeves. Because this is the underarm of the sleeve, and then this is the rest of the length of the shirt until we get to our hip marker. Okay, let's take half a hot second here and mark off the rest of the seam allowance on our 6 inch square for the rest of the gusset, because having your seam lines and knowing where to sew, it'll be very helpful, because this machine, as you can see, there is no markings on the faceplate to tell me how far out it is. I don't know, maybe it's just what was done in the usual way back in the day of how these were manufactured. No idea. This is also particularly handy for anybody who's doing this all by hand. You do not have to do this by machine. You can do this. Marking off your seam allowances and where your stitch line is handy for those of you who are sewing by hand, because you do not have to have a machine. You can sew it by hand. It'll just take longer. Just so you can kind of see where I'm at here. Here's the neck hole. This is the neck hole. This is the shoulder seam. This is fluff. This is the side shoulder seam, so that is the part that goes around here. And then the gusset is gonna sit here. Now we're gonna do the smart thing here and stop at that point so then that way you're not going into the seam allowance here. And we're gonna turn it around and go back, just so that doesn't come undone.
To sew the rest of the gusset in before putting in the gores, we'll need to match the seams on the sleeve first. And then sew the 6-inch seam on the gusset onto the body, which matching your sleeves will help to show where you need to position your gusset down. And then sew the gusset into place. We'll need to ensure that we leave a 1/2-inch seam allowance, as we'll need it to sew down the gores into place once those are in the right spot. So we're going to sew the gores together next. Now, do you remember how we cut from the main front and back, that's the same length as the rest of the garment, those triangles? Well, we're going to cut off the selvage edges, and then what we'll do is we'll mark our 1/2-inch seam allowance, and then sew each of those triangles the straight edge together that was in line with the selvage edge, and we'll sew those together first. What this will do is this will make a 2-piece gore that will fit into the side seams of your shirt or your shift. Now you can stop here if you're going to make a basic tunic or a not very wide shift. Now, however, in my case, because I will need a little bit more hip room, so we'll take the extra fabric that we had left over from the sleeves and then turn those into additional gores for the measurements that we made earlier from shoulder to hip. So what we'll suggest here is that you mark off now, if you haven't already done so, on the main body of your shift where your shoulder goes all the way down to your hips, and mark that on the main body of your garment. And then transfer that mark from where you pin the gore once it's sewn together to the underarm gusset. Line that up and then transfer that same mark onto the gores so you know where they'll sit when you sew it all together. Once you have where your additional hip gores are going to go, it's easier to sew those on first and pin 1/2 inch down from the tip of the gores triangle to allow for the seam allowance right on that line where you made for where your hip line is going to be. Then sew the additional hip gores down first, and then sew in the gore that goes directly under the underarm at the gusset point. This will give you a little bit more flare and a cool multi kind of triangle seam line. Also keep in mind that when you're making a basic tunic that just goes to just below the waist, you will not need to add the extra hip gores unless of course the shirt itself isn't wide enough. If it's not wide enough, attach all of the 4 gores at the top with all the points matching up. Pin the 4 gores at the end of the underarm gusset point. To sew the additional hip gussets in, if you are doing a full-length dress or shift, you'll see that I am pinning the straight edge to the body of the shirt or dress. And then when you're inserting the gore, you'll have diagonal on diagonal, and you'll see that in a moment. You might also see that I have a little bit left over at the bottom of each of those gores, and it seems like it's just leftover fabric because obviously how the gores each are going to be sitting, it's sitting lower than the full length of the garment. But don't worry, we have plans for using those up too. I'm marking in the blue pen so you can see the 1/2 inch seam allowance for where the gore is going to line up with the 1/2 inch seam allowance at the tip of the underarm gusset. Then I'm going to pin and sew down the length of the body from the underarm gusset to where the gore for the hips joins the body, and then sew the rest of that seam line for the gore along the gore for the hips to the bottom. And using a whole bunch of pins to make sure that you have everything in place is super crucial, especially at this point where there's a lot of fiddly little points that you have to contend with when you're trying to sew things down, so nothing gets caught where it doesn't belong underneath. And we'll get sewing into those last few seams before we start trimming up the bottom and setting up the neckline. We're going to want to trim up the bottom of the hemline first, and you'll want to do this in such a way that you have spare fabric left over if possible, and I'll show you why in a minute. First, we're going to press what we can flat, which I didn't show you because I hate ironing and pressing. Then with the folded gores, we're going to fold them in so then that way they're more or less flat-ish so you can see the overhang from the main front and back pieces. Now what we're going to do is we're going to line those up with the bottom of the hem for the front and back pieces and then cut that chunk of fabric off. And we're going to try and keep this as straight as humanly possible. Now you can use a rotary cutter and a self-healing mat if you have one, but in this case I marked it out and cut it off by hand. Next we have a funny peak on each spot where we cut it off. So if you want to make a stylistic choice by having a slightly handkerchief-esque hemline, you can leave that in, but I'm going to try to even that out by cutting it off. Again, by unfolding it, straightening it in a line with the front and back hemline, and then just cutting that part off. So here we are at the neckline. Remember those extra leftovers I said to set aside from the cutoff pieces from the gores that I mentioned earlier? Well, here's where we're going to use them. We're going to use the center seam line for those cut gore pieces to line up with the center of the front, and then as well as the center of the back. We'll fold those pieces on the seam line as closely as we can and line it up on the straight cut edge against the shoulders that is straight cut as well, and trace out the neckline by copying it from underneath. And you can usually feel this through the fabric. If you find this difficult, you might want to grab a piece of paper to trace out the cut line. You can do this by lining up the square edge of the paper and nudging it in against the seam on the inside of the garment that you made earlier. Now keep in mind that if you use the paper method, be sure that you give yourself ½ inch at the top of the seam allowance for the seam allowance on the shoulder seam, or otherwise it might fit a little bit funny. Once we have the neckline for the front traced, we're going to make sort of a semi-oval up to the shoulder seam line to round it out at the bottom. And what this will do is it'll make the bottom edge of the inside of the collar piece. And please make sure you do this to mimic the back side as well. When tracing out the neckline as well as the bottom edge of that collar or yoke piece, you have to make sure that both of the shoulder seams match up. Otherwise, again, it'll also fit funny. Now, one thing to keep in mind that because of how we're cutting out the yoke, it's not going to be seen from the outside of the garment, so you can always go back in and clean up that bottom edge a little bit later if it's a little bit uneven in your initial pattern drafting and cutting. And here we have both of our inner collar or yoke pieces cut out, and we'll line them up so then that way we can sew them along the shoulder seam. So it's sort of a clone of the neck holes that we had cut when we first started off the garment the first time. Now we'll want to make sure that we sew these pieces right sides together. Once the shoulder seams are sewn up on the yoke or the collar piece, we're going to pin them together for the yoke piece on the outside of the shifter shirt with right sides together, matching at the shoulder seams and the center front and the center back seams as was designated earlier. Then we're going to sew all of this down at 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now you'll want to make sure that you roll the bottom of the edge of the yoke or the collar piece first and sew that down to hide all of the raw edges, and please do this before you start pinning and sewing your yoke to the collar. This is a step that you should not skip where possible to get a super clean and finished look. Fold the yoke to the inside of the collar of your garment and press it down really well with an iron. A tailor's hem will also be a huge help on this part. I happen to have a tailor's hem set, but I have yet to make it. I bought the kit from Shannon at Shannon Makes, but again, I haven't had a chance to sew the tailor's hem kit together just yet. I'm kind of regretting I didn't do that first. Now keep in mind, alternatively, you can buy a tailor's hem at most sewing supply stores. As I did the ironing off screen with a rolled up towel or the edge of my ironing board, you'll want to iron it down in such a way that the seam line is just a smidge turned into the inside of the collar. Then once it's ironed at about a 1/4 inch in from the pressed edge, do some top stitching to sew the yoke inside so that it stays in place with the top stitching. The last thing to do for the final stretch of sewing is to fell down all of the inside seams and fold in the hems of the arms and the bottom hem by 1/2 inch, and then fold it again by 1/2 inch down and hem all of that into place using the felling stitch. So this will take a while, and I'm not going to spend the next week felling all those interior stitches because I want to wear it, so I'll meet you at the end for the reveal.